So far we've looked at all of the controls within the color corrector acting on the entire image. However, we can also restrict the parts of the image affected by the color grading settings using the Select tab. We looked at this briefly in the keying sections. We can start by using this panel here to pick out some particular characteristics of the image based on their color and luminance. And in the keying section we viewed our alpha channel to see what we were picking. Actually, within the color corrector it has its own way of showing us what we select without having to worry about the alpha channel. So let's just make a brief pick. So I'm going to enable the color picking and I'm going to pick the greens, and I'm now interested to know what I've got selected. Well, I can press the highlight button here and it will show me, without having to look at the alpha channel, what I've got selected. And in fact, in setup I can change how I see that. At the moment I'm seeing it as an alpha channel. I could alternatively see it as a cutout against black, or I could see it in highly saturated, which basically means that my selection is saturated and everything that's not selected is not. So you can see your selection in context. These are just viewing modes, so choose whichever one you feel most comfortable with. By the way, while we're here, the other useful things in setup is you can change how sensitive the controls are for any given mouse movement. So back to select. As we found in keying, we can select our parts of the image based on their hue. We can further refine it by saying that we're not interested in the least saturated of that color, or the most saturated of that color, or the darkest of that color, or the lightest of that color, and these can then have softness in. So I'm dragging with the left mouse button at the moment, but if I drag with the right mouse button, then I'll get some softness in that selection, or tolerance in that selection also. And we also saw before how we can modify what effectively is the clip tolerance and profile of that selection by either dragging these points or holding down Alt to insert a point. Then we also have controls to further modify the key. So for example, removing the white sparkles, i.e. small bits of detail that might bleed through, or blurring our key. We can actually also choose what the color corrector looks at in order to create these selections. At the moment, the key source is on source, which basically means it's taking the first input of the color corrector as the basis of its color key. But actually it could take any one of a further 4 inputs to the color corrector, and that allows you to take a key from one image and apply the color correction to another. An example would be, let's say you have some grainy or noisy footage and you want to keep it grainy and noisy, but you still want to be able to select from it and make a color correction, but the grain and noise is making all this quite difficult. Well, what you could do is run into the second input of the color corrector a denoised version. That would then allow you to do your selection from the denoised version but apply your color to the noisy version. The other thing we can choose here is which of the incoming channels this is looking at in order to make a selection. So of course it's on full RGB at the moment. We could, if we wanted to, just select any one of the incoming channels. Of course this then becomes largely irrelevant because we can't do a hue selection if we're only looking at one channel, but we can still use the luminance bar to isolate a particular band within a given channel. So having made our selection, now everything else on this particular layer, whichever tool we pick, will only work in that selection. I say in the selection, actually that's because inside is selected. Because we now have a selection, effectively what we have are 2 completely different color correctors. One to work inside the selection and one to work outside the selection. You can see as I hop between the two, the gamma ball is jumping because there are 2 settings. So if I wanted the inside to be this color, I could make the outside, i.e. the area that I have not selected, to be that color. And this is true for all of the tools. All of these tools will now only act on the images defined by inside or outside. So let's just add a second layer. So I've just gone to layer, add layer. So by highlighting this layer, we now have an upper layer of color correction. So for example with this, rather than make a selection by color, perhaps I'd make a selection based on a shape, in which case we have 3 basic shapes, a line, a circle or a rectangle, or we could use the actual shapes functions within Mamba to draw our own bespoke shape. So with the ellipse, for example, I can drag it around, control drag to change its size and shift to change its softness. So now if I go to outside, we can now be grading outside that shape. So you can see we have 2 layers of color correction going on. On vector 2, we're doing the outsides, and on base, we're playing with the color of the grass. And we can keep building layers of color correction because they all add together. And if on an upper layer we don't make a selection, then everything we've previously graded will be adjusted. We can also use the Select tab to help route our image around. So if I add another layer and go to Select, and in this case we'll pick up another ellipse. In Select, using the Recover mode, I can fill the inside of the shape with something other than just the result of the color correction so far, which is by default what it will get. So under Recover mode, I can recover to the inside and then choose what it is I want to recover. So, for example, if I went to the output of layer 2, then you can see that inside this circle, it doesn't have the effects that we put in on layer 3. Let's just make that more extreme so we can see it. So essentially, the images are coming in, they're being processed in order through here, and the result of that processing gives us this. But using the Recover mode, I can then infill any selection, whether that be by the windows or by color selections, using the Recover mode and then choosing which point goes inside that shape. So for example, I could go back to the original source, so this circle now has a completely ungraded element inside it. So at the moment we've made our selections based on either a shape or by a color selection. We can also bring in external alpha channels. So for example, if I were to just bring up a piece of type, something again very simple, and I'll insert this as the second input to the color corrector. What we could now do, if I add another layer, is under Select, I could combine any selection that I've made here, which at the moment I'm selecting everything, as we can see from the highlight. So I could combine that with some logic and an incoming alpha channel. So I've got my alpha channel coming in on input 2. So now we have this as our selected area inside the color corrector, which also then allows us to make color corrections within that area. This selection is combined with whatever I've got here. So you can see if I start moving this, I'm basically saying by doing that I only want to select the areas that are defined by the external alpha channel, so long as they're not the least saturated parts of the image. Apart from choosing which input we're looking at for the alpha channel, we can also choose which channel. It just so happens the type generator generates its output on the alpha channel as well. If it was just a white on black image, then I could choose one of the RGB channels. Also in the Select tab is a control to blur our selection, and that's here. So you can see we're blurring inside our selected area. Then under the Overlay mode, apart from different standard compositing styles for our layer in general, there are also a couple of different ways of handling that blur. For example, if I switch from normal to blur under, we can see a difference of how the edge of the selection is handled. What we're seeing here is the edge of the selection is totally honored. So when we blur, there is no element of this color being blurred into here. If I switch back to normal, we can see that this edge is getting darker because this area and this area are being blurred together. With blur over, we can see that we're allowing our blurred element to spill over the edge of the selection. So depending on your application, these are the different variations of how we can apply a blur. Also in the Select is the clamp function, which allows us to cut off illegal signals. So let's add another layer, and in this layer I'm going to completely crush the blacks. So they've gone massively illegal and massively off the scale. But if I add yet another layer, you'll see that they can all be recovered, because Mamba is always working in a high dynamic range environment. However, if I went back to layer 6 and switched on clamp blacks, we can see that actually now what's happened is on vector 6, when I wound the blacks right down, because clamp was on, it was essentially cutting off all the detail that went below black. So we can use this as a legalizer, but we can also use it in scenarios like this if we truly want to clean away very black or very white detail, because we can set our clamps to be black or white, or if we select on, then it's both of them. Let's just remove those two layers. Another function in the color corrector is blend. So we can pick any particular layer and we can blend in or out the effect of that layer. What's quite nice about this is it goes above 100%. So when we have our client saying, yes, I like that, can you do it more? We don't have to work out which direction we were moving the ball in. This will just extend whatever we were doing. Then the final area in the select are these. This basically says what channels the resulting color correction is applied to. So that would only apply my color correction to the blue channel and leave the red and the green alone. Or that would apply my color correction only to the chroma or only to the luma. So the color corrector effect within Mamba gives us a very high degree of control over the color content of our images, whether we're using that to make our images prettier or whether we're using it in the context of keying to make our foregrounds and backgrounds match.